Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Deep State. Our show today is entitled Useful Idiots, Woke versus Anti-Woke. And I'm trying to get beneath the sort of the drama of world politics and discover perhaps the animating feature or a certain agenda that's at place that I have sometimes described as sort of a memory hold cosmic conspiracy. So I want to sort of think about what these forces are that surround this phenomenon called woke or anti-woke. And is there sort of a mutual animating principle and even an agenda beneath both of those? And I'm going to suggest that there is, and it's part of what we have described as this cosmic conspiracy against God and man, against Christ and his church. Much of this has been memory hold. So some of what we're going to do here is pull a couple thinkers who have been memory hold and kind of bring up some of these ideas on both the woke and anti-woke side and see what's playing out here. And can we make sense or distangle the woke from the anti-woke and see perhaps where both of them are taking the world mind today? So one of the things I want to introduce is a thinker named Manning Johnson, who I'll focus on one book in particular that was published in 1958 called Color, Communism, and Common Sense. One of the pictures from that is on the thumbnail. I want to, and that's going to kind of highlight the woke, kind of some of the core, not the deep, deep core, because this is part of a permanent revolution against God and man, but sort of a mid 20th century kind of expose on the roots of, I think, the modern iteration of the woke mind virus. But conversely, I'm going to talk about sort of a mind virus on the anti-woke side as well. And what I'm going to do there is look over just some basic moves of what the neoconservative movement is, where it came from, and what its agenda is, and how it can sort of sometimes disguise itself. So both from the left, we have some sort of disguising going on with the woke and the anti-woke movement. And the third part, I will have to finish off over on locals, which is an expose on the deeper animating principles. And this was published by Nesta Webster in about almost 125 years ago. And it's called The World Revolution, the Plot Against Civilization. So she's going to kind of put together pieces from both of those, taking from different revolutions throughout the age and finding a deeper principle behind that and a common agenda. So that's what we're up to. One of the things that I just heard this morning and I had to mention from the former president, I guess people still use the expression president even when they're out of office, Trump. And one of the videos that we have over there on locals is how he's sort of been almost crowned through a couple of awards over the last couple of months over in the Middle East, almost crowning him Messiah. But he's done this before, but more recently said that I am the solution. I am, in a sense, the Messiah. I don't think this time I don't think he said the chosen one at this moment, but he has said that in the past. And a couple crazy things came out recently. He was speaking. He said, Christians, get out and vote. I'm not a Christian, but just this time, get out and vote, and you will never have to do it again. I'll fix everything, something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing. And this is extraordinary language, that something on this side of the equation is who uses that kind of language. Just vote this time and it'll all be fixed. Probably a warning of some type at the very least that there is a certain agenda at play At least it needs to be considered pretty seriously. And he's, while tipping his hat that he's going to be a sort of messianic figure that's going to permanently fix the system, and then he reminds his audience, and there will be retribution. And that's where you get the people going, yeah, 4 years of this woke stuff. He's going to make everything right. He's going to get the deep state and go after those people and the retribution for everything they've done. And that's kind of a pattern. When I talk about Manning Johnson creating this woke virus, creating all the tension in the world, and then seeing that manifest in the chaos of society, and then the desire to see it as a mind virus and respond to it. And then with that kind of language that comes with it, the opposing team kind of seeing that as, even if it's part of Trump derangement syndrome, some kind of totalitarian speech, a mind virus of its own, and there might be some truth there. So yeah, I'm speaking here in some sense in an American context, but nothing's unique to America in terms of Trump here or the stories I'm going to be talking about or the birthing of this unique type of neo-imperialistic program called neoconservatism. So I'm going to look at that. And what I'm going to suggest here is that voting and politics used to be about at least the illusion that we're getting involved somehow in our consent toward fundamental aspects of the nation states that we belong to, whether it's war or the economy or some semblance of say in how the government operates. And I think things have been reduced to these triggering mechanisms, these algorithmic nudging of sort of the experience I personally have when I go on Twitter. Everything just makes you want to think society's gone mad. Something's got to fix that. And conversely, depending on how you're being algorithmically nudged, the contrary, like there's some sort of totalitarian order that wants to take us back to some kind of dark age. So it's really this tension of emotions that's operating, a really distorted aspect of our passions or a disordered aspect of our passions. I'm speaking definitely beyond the Anglosphere here. And so we're operating at that very base level and not really thinking in a serious way, like how we could together shape the operations of government that would in any way be for the betterment of all. That kind of idea is gone. And that's the core of a Republican idea, that there's some concept of the common good that remains. So absent of all this is this idea of really that we're consenting to fundamental ideas. It's more like get in there, rid ourselves of this woke virus, retribution. And it's almost as if our emotions are all getting played up to enter into this alchemical process. And what I'm going to say, or I have said for quite a while, is with this information, the idea that I'm doing here, what I'm driving at, is that when we see the operation and how it manipulates the minds of the left and the right, we can withdraw from it, because giving our consent to it is giving our consent to this, I'll just spill the beans, this messianic project that's being shaped from both the left and the right. So before I continue, I am going to look up the phrase here, useful idiots. And do I have it on here? So the phrase, it's a useful idiot or useful fool, a pejorative description of a person struggling, of suggesting that that person thinks they are fighting for a cause without fully comprehending the consequences of their actions, and who does not realize they are being cynically manipulated by the cause's leaders or by other political players. It's sometimes used in association with the Cold War, oftentimes maybe accurately or not so accurately attributed to Lenin and the idea within communism that most people are useful idiots and that communism has, in fact, other aims outside the equality of all. And another term I considered using here would be proxy warriors. And what I'm going to suggest is that the goal is to make everybody in the world some sort of proxy warrior or proxy warrior or useful idiot for the machinery. We're all being manipulated from one direction or another through the control of information around us. That the goal here is to have our minds and our will bended to this agenda that we really don't completely understand. And that sort of consent, then, I would argue, and always have, is giving it to a very dark force that's appearing as a light force. And that's what Lenin cynically meant when he said that they're not going to truly understand our aims. They're just useful idiots for the revolution. And I'm going to say we have a revolution on the right and a revolution on the left. And both of these revolutions are working against this higher reality that is or was present throughout most of Christian civilization. And it's bringing us down into our most base passions in order to manipulate us and take us into this messianic age. And that's what I've argued throughout. And then we'll see some of that with this memory holding of these individuals. So what I want to get to now is the work of Mr. Johnson. And I can only show excerpts because, of course, I can't show the whole book. And I want to begin here. And the title of the book is Color, Communism, and Common Sense. And here's a little briefing. The explosive expose of the communist plan to use the Negro, and so this is 1958, so that's the operative term at that time, the Negro race to sow divisions, foment race wars, and ultimately bring about a socialist totalitarian state, was written by an American Negro communist who defected from the party when he realized its cynical exploitation of Negroes was destroying the social fabric of Black communities and harming his own people. Manning Johnson, who quote unquote died suddenly, died unexpectedly soon after his book was published, understood the risks of defecting from and denouncing communism, and he was an American hero. His book is available on PDF. I'd never heard of it. That doesn't mean it's completely memory hold, but it's one of the reasons I'm fascinated by it, because it's a brilliant expose of his experience within the communist parties, rising up through the ranks, and some of the observations in terms of how they create these useful idiots or proxy warriors. And as I'm doing it, I'd like our minds to kind of work in two directions. One, so much of what he's going to talk about is going to be reminiscent of the sort of George Floyd movement that came around over the last few years. And we think of the Soros funding of it. And some people can only see that side of the alchemical equation, that this is like almost a single boogeyman, and he's going to remind us that the funding and the program for the Soroses goes much deeper than that. Black Lives Matter, it didn't escape me, the expression, who, were sort of a proxy warriors, and we could kind of see it. They were kind of sent out to the streets. Some were more organized than others. Bricks were made available, go and trash things. He's going to say this stuff's been going on since the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and even unto the day he's publishing this. And much of it's published, obviously, in the States during the era of segregation. So a couple of things to highlight here. That would be some of the original graphics. The man himself. In the preface, Archibald Roosevelt is one of the descendants of the bloodline of the Roosevelts, but he seems to be very frank here. In modern literature, anti-communists are generally pictured as scoundrels. On the other hand, left-wing purgers and jailbirds are shown as persecuted lambs. But there is a special vitriol uncorked for those who have followed communism and have repented to such an extent that they are publicly willing to stand up and testify against it by word and deed. And this is what he happened to do pertaining to the US Supreme Court decision. And one of the justices, Felix Frankfurt, would brand Manning Johnson as tainted. And even the New York Herald Tribune joyfully took up the cry. Of course, careful investigation shows that Manning Johnson is not a perjurer, and it would be very easy to prove this in any court not dominated by such characters as Felix Frankfurter. Manning Johnson's story begins much like many other Negroes brought up in the religious home. He was inducted into the quote unquote party largely because of the preaching of a communist bishop retired of the Episcopal Church, William Montgomery Brown. Manning Johnson is a man of color and education and felt himself frustrated by his race and color and fell under the mind virus or spell of communism. And so what we're going to see here is there's a tweaking of scripture both on the left and the right. In this case, it's more of this creation of this social gospel that would draw people in, and it's really not a reflection of scripture historically understood. On the other side, we have this Zio-Christianity, and sometimes one of the buzzwords you're going to hear is Judeo-Christianity, which is an oxymoron that's going to be used by the Neoconservatives, which is beyond problematic, but we'll get to that in a moment. The communists, however, reckoned without understanding that the man they had enlisted in their cause had, for them, certain dangerous qualities. He had a Christian upbringing, he was intelligent, and he had courage. His Christian upbringing made him revolt at the obscene immorality of the communist parties and its members. His intelligence made him see through the stupidity of the communist doctrine and see that he should strive to be a first-class Negro instead of an imitation of a third-class white man. His courage made him willing to confess his sins in public and try to expedite them. It is for this last quality that the Frankfurter Supreme Court and left-wing press never forgave him. You will read the story of one Negro who has gone through the fire and came out tempered steel. And one of the reasons, because part of the simulacrum, and I'll do another discussion on that later this week, the power of it, is that we really don't want to look down the memory hole because it's not in circulation. We want to go, what's the story of the week? The outrage in Paris. And we want to get part of that loop and go. And it's not enough people have gotten up this week and gave their 5 cents about what's going on in Paris. And so that's what we want to do. What's in circulation? And I would encourage people when we go back and look at the memory hole, if there's a certain aspect of reality that is being buried. And by recovering that, it helps us all to return to a fuller reality. And not only that, but people that I'm sure that accident that happened after that really puts him as a sense of he's a hero. And I think we should recognize these people, even though society at large does not. He says, 10 years I labored in the cause of communism. I was a dedicated quote unquote comrade. All my talents and efforts were zealously used to bring about the triumph of communism in America and throughout the world. To me, the end of capitalism would mark the beginning of an interminable period of plenty, peace, and prosperity. And that's the big dream. If we could all just do X, Y, and Z, it's almost like immanentizing the eschaton. Heaven and earth would come about if we could only overcome this one barrier. Peace and plenty and prosperity. To take these eminentized ideas, or I'm sorry, these ideas of the eschaton, the perfect world that's beyond our separation, which is the new heaven and the new earth, and bring those down. And those are the sources of so many revolutions. And that's what revolutionaries want to paint instead of this picture of a millennial picture in your head that's transcendent. They want to put those ideas and misplace them, take misplaced categories, put them in your head so you're working for man rather than God. All races and classes, all races, racial and class differences and conflicts would end forever after the liquidation of capitalists, their government, and their supporters. A world union of Soviet states under the hegemony of Russia would be realized. Little did I realize until I was deeply enmeshed in the red conspiracy that just and seeming grievances are exploited and transformed idealism into a cold and ruthless weapon against the capitalist system. That is the end toward which all communist efforts among Negroes are directed. So he's kind of saying, in short, what's going on. It's a conspiracy. It works on this idealism and plays on the idealistic mind, but at the end of it is something entirely different. He's talking about his placement. He rose up to be one of the top Negro communists and was placed in the Negro Commission. And so he was working directly with the Communist Party, directly out of the Kremlin. And so he realized very much that the Kremlin hierarchy, to some extent, he realizes the Bolshevik character of this was behind what was going on. Under the guise of unity of black and white in the struggle, several top white communists were in fact had malicious intents. Moreover, these white overseers are the surest functional guarantee of the maintenance of the hierarchical authoritarian control of the Kremlin over their Negro lickspittles, directing the conspiracy among Negroes in America. In this connection, I observed how white women communists are used as political prostitutes, cohabiting with high-level Negro communists in order to spy on them. Through such intimate relationships, these white women communists are able to elicit information pertaining to the family background, sources of income, marital difficulties, arrests, convictions, opinions of communist policy, and communist leadership. This information is invaluable to the red hierarchy in relations with the Negro lickspittles. The top red circles is known as bedroom politics, and that is how the world's run. We know in our halls of Congress, beyond, and I don't want to be uniquely American here, everybody's blackmailed and everybody's paid off. Again, organizations such as APEC brag that 97% of the people they fund come into power and that they have powerful influences over those people. So that's not new, and these techniques have been around for a long time, and I'm sure they were there even before communism, but he's saying it in pretty easy terms. That's just how they operate at their base level. Thus, as a participant on the highest level of the communist conspiracy in America, I observed the cold, calculating, ruthless nature of red power politics and political warfare, stripped of all its illusory propaganda and idealistic cover. Now, again, on both sides, a part of this is to subvert or pervert our religious ideals and immanentize them, take them not into how they were intended as a walk of faith toward the eschaton, the finished work, but pervert them, immanentize them, take them down to the earthly and revolutionize them, or put them into a revolutionary project. created doubt, lack of confidence, suspicion, setting up situations that bring about racial bitterness, violence, and conflict, putting forth demands so unrealistic that race relations are worsened, attacking everybody in disagreement as reactionaries, fascists, Ku Klux Klanners among whites and Uncle Toms among Negroes constitute the red pattern of operation. So the animating principle here, we're going to see this again with Nesta Webster when she talks about world revolution. It's fomented by bitterness, either it's economic or racial bitterness. And this, when Trump uses a word like retaliation, he's tapping into this emotion. Fortunately, the overwhelming majority of Negroes in whose name the communists and their ilk presume to speak have not fallen for these blandishments of the Reds. They know a red light when they see one. The same cannot be said of many Negro intellectuals. And this is an important part of the control mechanism when we think about believe the science, kind of capture those people first, and we're getting a sense of how they're captured here. Many Negro intellectuals carrying the ball for communists, since the communists have always looked upon Negro intellectuals as shallow, superficial, phrasemongers, and incompetents, looking for a loaf when they, on a basis of ability, are not worth a crumb. Their pro-communist behavior becomes all the more tragic and ludicrous. So again, it's the opposite of this idealism that they propose to be about. He's talking about relations here with Moscow, being in direct communication with them. He's getting then to a little bit about the church. A large number of Negro ministers are all for the communist. Some are prominent and influential, others are run-of-the-mill. They, in common, believe that beating the racial drum is a shortcut to prominence, money, and the realization of personal ambitions, even if the Negro masses are left prostrate and bleeding, expendables in the mad scramble for power. So there's a desire to look after the intellectuals and the spiritual elites in these communities, pervert them, and their message becomes perverted. The public denunciation of Negro, quote unquote, sky pilots, cynical communist name for clergy. So the movement leaders would call them sky pilots, was likewise stopped on orders from Moscow. The deeply religious Negro masses, whom the Kremlin wanted to use as expendables in the struggle for power, shed away from the party. A frontal attack on religion resulted in isolation of Negroes. Therefore, deception was to be tried. The honeyed phrase replaced the harsh words. The smile replaced the smirk. The velvet glove covered the mailed fist. Humility replaced arrogance. The handshake replaced hostility. All that was distasteful and wicked in the past was to be forgotten in the face of a need for a common front against white oppression. The devil was sick, and an angel he would be. So this is one kind of fundamental thing about Marxism. It doesn't believe in human nature. So part of the overarching project purports to change human nature itself. And it's so different when you think of people that might be priests. The idea that we're living in a fallen state and we're limited by natural law and the nature of man and man's anthropology in relation to God in terms of what is actually doable. But when man gets clouded by these idealistic visions, some of those things get lost. The bulk of Negro church members are in the South. They live by the quote unquote good book. Anyone against the good book is the devil. There is no in between. The red carpetbaggers discovered this when they touched the Negro's religion. So they avoided this sore spot in order to snare their intended victims. Get them involved in the movement first and later do the job of religious convictions was the order. Anything else was putting the cart before their horse. And so how they're going to kind of, so you need to kind of get them into the party mindset and then work on the religious part. The new line went something like this. Jesus was a carpenter, was a worker like the communist. He was against the money changers, the capitalists, the exploiters of the day. That is why he drove them out of the temple. The communists are the modern day fighters against capitalists or money changers. If Jesus were living today, he would be persecuted like the communists who seek to do good for the common people. So it's very much of a social kind of gospel. The divinity of Christ gets left out, and what's remaining is man trying to improve man. The red plot against the Negroes. Stirring up race and class conflict is the basis of all discussion of the Communist Party's work in the South. It's always stirring up hostility. The evil genius Stalin and other megalomaniacal leaders in Moscow ordered the use of all racial, economic, and social differences. And that's where we're at today. And again, that's what colonizers do. They divide tribes in pieces, make sure you're all around, everybody's around somebody in some way that's different, then you heighten those differences. So you're always doing some variation of woke versus anti-woke. You want to keep everybody in that frame of mind where it's just really about pushing people's buttons. And today, of course, it's the same things going on throughout the whole of society, that everybody's become a proxy warrior. Everybody's involved in some type of identity politics. It's male versus female. Plus, on top of that, now we have multiple ways of identifying gender. North versus south, east versus west. And throughout the thrust of the Communist Party, it was mostly just the exploitation of the rich versus the poor. When that sort of got smoothed over, so that we weren't looking at this mega rich anymore, now it's just kind of splitting up every notion of identity possible. So it's perpetual war, never looking up at the colonizers. Black rebellion was what Moscow wanted. Bloody racial conflict would split America, and really speaks to what's going on today with these preludes of the possibility of civil war. Really we see it so much through algorithms and the working of social media, how it kind of finds out what your fine buttons are and keeps hitting on that button. During the confusion, demoralization, and panic would set in, and finally the Reds say, quote, "Workers stop work. Many of them seize arms by attacking arsenals. Many had armed themselves before. Street fights become frequent. Under the leadership of Communist Party, the workers organized revolutionary committees to be in command of the uprising." The perfidy, it's a good word, kind of, I think, because we're going to probably discover from Nesta Webster that the perfidious ones were the deep animating characters behind much of this. The perfidy of these Negro Reds is all the more infamous when one reads from the pen of a top Negro communist who wrote, prior to the Sixth Congress, white chauvinism, i.e., racial prejudice, made progress in Negro work well nigh impossible. Just this constant anger. White chauvinism manifests itself in open or concealed opposition to doing work among Negroes. The tendency was to ignore the leading Negro comrades when formulating policy. As punishment for their opposition, Negro comrades were refused support, financial, in getting out the weekly news service, which was sent out to some 300 Negro newspapers. Negro comrade was disciplined for his insistence in bringing before the conference a tabooed question of Negro work. White leftists descended on the Negro communities like locusts, posing as quote unquote friends, come to help quote unquote liberate their Black brothers. Along with these white communist missionaries came the Negro political Uncle Toms to allay the Negroes' distrust and fears of these strangers. Uncle Toms to allay the Negroes' distrust and fears of these strangers. Everything was interracial and interracialism artificially created, cleverly devised as camouflage of the red plot used by the Negro. So again, he's writing this in 1958, and he'd kind of woken up for several years. So he's really focusing in this bit on the 1930s, late 20s, 30s, and into the 1940s. A little bit more. Many Negro intellectuals, artists, professionals, etc., were carried away with this outburst of interracialism. Here was an opportunity to be accepted by other racial groups. So the in group kind of got them frustrated, and then the white liberators kind of come with a solution. And I suppose this is not fashionable to say, but within these separated communities, it has been noted that there was the point he's making here is there's a stronger and more vibrant family structure. So what's really going on there, as far as he's concerned, is the destruction of the Negro family structure. Secretly, they had always wanted to get away from the other Negroes. Moving around among whites would somehow add to their stature and endow a feeling of importance. So they went after communist interracialism like a hog going after slop. He's talking about some of the aspects of just about how fake this desire to liberate the Negro was. He's saying here, a well-known Negro real estate man called together a group of prominent Negro intellectuals and professionals for the purpose of launching a Negro housing development through the purchase of land and home construction. Such a project, he argued, would go a long way in showing other races that Negroes can build ideal communities and maintain standards second to none. He had maps showing fine locations that even from a land purchase angle proved that it was a good investment. But he couldn't get to first base. Why? Because they were against setting up Negro communities, that is, segregating ourselves. They, he said, were all for integration in the white communities. And I think part of why this is so memory hold is this idea that there were strong communities, and if you had to make something happen, you would draw from all the skill sets available and develop those skill sets. With this sort of manufactured integration, there was a destruction of the family and the skill sets, and that's what he's especially focusing on. Okay. Obviously, this line deliberately spread by the communists leads to the worst kind of mischief. It strengthens and creates racial prejudice and lays the basis for sharp racial conflicts. Shirking social responsibility and blaming others may be the easy way, but it's only a shortcut to communist slavery. So always getting you pissed off, go out and get your due, but there's an agenda behind that, which is actually harmful for you and your community, destroying the opposition. And then we'll just go through a little bit more. No small amount of support of the communist cause came from important and influential Negro newspapers. The late Robert Minor, a top red, wrote, in some of these papers repeatedly appeal to open admissions that the Communist Party is the only party that advocates or fights for equal rights of Negroes and the right of self-determination of the Negro right. So again, the monopoly of the press, if that's all the information you're hearing, it's repeated that only through a constant state of anger and this perpetuating this and fomenting this frustration can this idealized vision someday be made, and you don't realize that everything that was working is being destroyed. Again, it's so apt to what's going on generally with the overall destruction of the American economy, generally speaking, since deindustrialization in the 1980s. And of course, this is going on in replacing it with some kind of high-tech economy, which really just destroys the social fabric of a nation state. I wanted to, I think I'm going to move on to a little bit about the real Uncle Toms. Here's an example right here. Posing as a quote unquote friend of the Negro, they, under the guise of a campaign for Negro rights, set race against race. And again, I don't know if you're aware of this. I believe the NAACP organization, that's the National Association for the Advancement of Color People, was created in 1913, and it was controlled by the perfidious ones from the beginning. In fact, they gave Negroes very little say for several decades. Posing as a friend of the Negro, under the guise of campaign of Negro rights, set race against race in the cold-blooded struggle for power. Their hypocrisy and falsity of their claims are cleverly revealed in a number of instances. One of them right here, while the white Reds were renting apartments and subletting them to Negroes to stir up racial bitterness and hate, such as existed in Stuyvesant Town, New York City, they carefully avoided living in a Negro community. A top white Red was in the act of moving to the Riverton housing project in Harlem, but decided against it because, to quote him, a survey disclosed that only 5 to 7% of the inhabitants of the project were white families, and therefore that would have been a bad environment to raise my children, creating hate. And I think that will give us kind of the final sense of this book. But yeah, I think we're all familiar with stories of limousine liberals, whether they're black or white, and they talk one way about the community and this and that, and they get in their cars and all go to the fancy suburbs. And why people more often don't see that, I do not know. Oftentimes my students, the salary of a Texas state legislature or one of our national legislatures, or the annual salary of one of our governors or the president of the United States or people on our Supreme Courts is very low, but yet they all live in these mansions. And, people don't really just ask, like, does this make any sense? They're living in these mansions as they're pandering to the poor and saying, I'm just like you, and I'm one of the. Why people can't see through this, because they are involved in a kind of virus or type of egregore where that's their promise. They got these, as Lippmann would say, these pictures in their heads, and this is going to be the good life. Instead of it's been immanentized, the picture of the good life that's promised, the transcendent true good life that we were wired deeply in order to pursue, has been shifted into these earthly promises, but they're done, in the case of the history of these Reds, they're part of malicious lies for a malicious agenda. The Red propagandist distorts the facts concerning racial differences for ulterior motives. All the right is not on the Negro side. Neither is all the wrong. The same, and what he's just demonstrating here is just he's backing out of this and not taking the opposite track as we go into neoconservatism. He's not becoming a radical in the other direction. He's just using good common sense. There's good and bad in both people, and you can't see this until you can back out of it. So like he said, he had a solid religious education, and he was intelligent, and he could kind of see the dialectics at play here. And this is him backing out of it. The repository of good or evil is not to be found in any particular race. Black men are just as good or bad as white men. Yellow men are just as good or bad as brown or red. It behooves anyone to speak about the other. White men sold, this is something you don't hear mentioned very often. White men sold white men as slaves. Black men sold black men as slaves. Black rulers are no more humane than yellow, red, white. Neither are they less brutal. The replacing of the repository of everything right and just among the darker races is a dastardly communist trick to use race as a means of grabbing and enslaving the whole of humanity. And this is the agenda. This is the communist agenda, enslaving the whole of humanity. It's part of the cosmic conspiracy against God and man, against Christ and his church. And it's the ending of humans through depopulation and transhumanism, which is the ultimate dehumanizing of the human being. Moscow Negro tools and the incitement of racial warfare place all the ills on the Negro at the door of the white leaders of America. Capitalism and imperialism are made symbols of oppressive white rule in keeping with instructions from the Kremlin. To one familiar with red trickery, it is obvious that placing the blame for all Negro ills at the door of white leaders in America is to remove all responsibility from the Negro. This tends to make the Negro, this is kind of the final bit here, feel sorry. This is in short, this is where people are being pushed today on the woke side. It's the victim mentality, right? It's feel sorry for himself because this social justice movement got turned into gender and then into gender identification. And it's going to go beyond because it's part of a transhuman. You're always searching for something that doesn't exist. Feel sorry for himself, blame others for his failures, ignore the countless opportunities around him, because when you're in that frame of mind, you can't see the countless opportunities around you. Jealous of the progress of other racial and national groups, expect the white man to do everything for him, look for easy and quick solutions as a substitute for the harsh realities of competitive struggle to get ahead. So to our modern ears, that sounds like the language of a conservative or a free market person, but from his perspective, it's just common sense. And there we have the birth of the woke mind virus, not the ultimate deepest root, because it goes back into the history of revolution, but one that we still see around us with, I think he's sort of an international figure in terms of what he funds, is the George Soros phenomenon, that he's going to go in there. And he even goes into campuses like on the Spring and will always be there to make sure there's something on the other side buzzing it up. So what I want to do right now is I want to tap a little bit on neoconservatism and how that likely takes these ideal people, just regular folks, sometimes just old-fashioned conservatives. I have no problem. I don't want to progress to some new vision of the world. I just want to kind of keep doing what I'm doing. I want the country to kind of keep staying the course, and how that got perverted starting in the 1970s and the 80s in the Anglo-American sphere and beyond, and to the detriment of the rest of the world because of its neo-imperialistic implications. So I'm going to look at the old Wikipedia here and pull down the concept of neoconservatism, because what I'm arguing right now is that instead of really looking at the policies of what's been accomplished by neoconservatism over the last 2 decades and just look at the costs compared to the benefits and cold hard facts, the raw manipulation that was used over and over again, is to kind of forget about all that, forget about what's going on right now in Central Asia, what used to be called Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and instead just focus on retaliation. If I get in, I'm going to go after that mind virus, not realizing just that frame of mind that he said. It's almost like I've been a victim of these people. Now I'm going to get back. It's the phrasing, it's one of the ingredients in forging these kind of mind viruses so that it's hard for us to stand back and go, wait a minute, this group, this quote unquote conservative movement is not doing, its aims aren't what it purports to be. So, neoconservatism. What I want to point out in this article from Wikipedia is that I first looked at this. This is what kind of got me, these are kind of some of the roots of what got me into Dr. Deep State, was this became an essential part of my dissertation, which was entitled The Epistemic Origins of American Empire. And I had to go back through the history of empire to kind of create this thing. But it kind of ended with this thing called the Bush Doctrine, which in a sense said that we can basically attack anybody for any reason because we're America. And we can create any pretense. And if the people making these decisions are profiting, if they're major shareholders in the Carlyle Group and Halliburton, you can't question us because that's anti-perfidious. And this is how crazy this is all going to be. And what I want to point out is this entry, when I first looked at it, it was prior to, because Wikipedia was still kind of new back then. It was pretty new. The invasion of Iraq was in 2003. So there was an entry for this, and it existed in some formulation for a year or two after that. And it was much more telling about what the movement was. And plus all just my experience talking about neoconservatism. So as I go through the Wikipedia, I just want to highlight how sanitized it is and has become. So a basic idea here, it's a political movement that began in the United States and the United Kingdom during the 1960s Vietnam War. Neoconservatives typically advocate a unilateral promotion of democracy and interventionism in international affairs, grounded in a militaristic and realistic philosophy of peace through strength. They are known for espousing opposition to communism. So right there, opposition to communism, you're going to have within that rubrics opposition to wokeism, because the two seem to be connected, as we talked about with the Red Conspiracy. Two things I'll highlight here. There's really a clever play that they do here. They take these two ideas that sound good and they manipulate them broadly. And so they're doing it in the really within the scholarship of international relations. So I'll make this kind of simple. One idea is liberalism, and what they mean by that is sort of classical liberalism, what we say capitalism, free markets. So one of their ideas is we're going to go across the world to make things safe for democracy, for free markets everywhere, so women aren't wearing habibs someplace and this kind of stuff. So that's always the thing that, oh, some tiny little country here is abusing somebody, so we're going to introduce these free markets. Of course, this is kind of blatant sort of colonialism that are going to go in there and create proxy warriors, proxy, crony capitalist leaders in this country, and they're going to, I'll use a Marxist word, exploit the resources on behalf of the commanding heights of the economy, as Lenin would call it. So in one sense, we're going to do what's good here in Britain, Ireland, France. We're going to open the markets abroad because everybody, all ships rise. That's kind of the language. So in order to help our nation state, we're going to liberalize the world. Well, this is the New World Order. You're just breaking down boundaries throughout the world. And when you break down boundaries, you break down family structures and everything traditional that goes along with that. So under the guise of helping nations, we're going to internationalize the economy. It's an oxymoron, and not many people can see through it. And it's gotten so blatantly. I think the rhetoric is so lame that some people kind of finally picked up on it. The other thing from international relations, they're realists. And what that means is realism is all about security. So you would think you'd want security for your nation, in a classical sense for your language, culture, and borders. To secure the borders, we might have to sometimes defend them, but we'll even defend them offensively. And that's where you get this cockamamie idea, like we'll get them over there before they get us over here. And it's just a sleight of hands. And that's a critical ingredient in the rise of American empire. That was a doctrine created way back prior to the Spanish-American War. Before it becomes a mushroom cloud, we're going to go whatever this kind of crazy stuff was. Get them over there before they come over here. Preemptively, we're going to figure out, kind of like this preemptive policing, what they must be thinking. We're going to go bomb them because we're going to tell everybody they were bombing us. So between these two things that sound like they're preserving the nation state, realism and liberalism, they're in fact, because ultimately with realism, the only way you can have true security throughout the world is to have one dominant hegemonic power. And that's so much of realism is placed on this idea of hegemonic theory. That's the entity, sometimes nation state, that creates and enforces the rules of the international community. So if we have a strong hegemon, the stronger the hegemon, the more security for everybody. What's not being realized on here within all of this is that the the people that truly make and create the rules, make and enforce the rules of the international community, are most interested in profit, and profit comes through war. So under the guise of, it's just very Orwellian, under the guise of we're creating peace, they create war. And again, if I were saying this 10 years ago, people would say, oh, that sounds a little eggheady. You're getting ahead of yourself. I think it's so blatant these days. And when we see the complete capture of our legislatures, whether in America or abroad, I think it's pretty in your face just how pernicious these forces are and what the agenda is. It's preparation of the world for this new messianic age. And that's why Trump is such a central figure of at least creating that category of thought, this anticipation of thought, this egregore in the minds of the world population. So, whoops, I'm over here. Okay, so many adherents to neoconservatism become politically influenced during the Republican era of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Here are some prominent names: Paul Wolfowitz, Elliot Abrams, Richard Pearl, Paul Bremer, et al. So you kind of see they're all part of a metropolitan tribe. Many of them are literally New Yorkers. And a little bit more down here, we get the idea. Well, we'll see the phrase right here. The movement had its intellectual roots in the magazine Commentary, edited by Norman Podestas. They spoke out against the New Left. Again, they used the wokeism. That wasn't the new. They used what was being fomented in what we just read: color, communism, and common sense. What they had fomented. Now they're the answer. Problem, reaction, solution. So now they're going to be a force that comes up to deal with all those disgruntled people. And what I want to highlight a little bit right here is, see, many of them were kind of changing the counterculture, and you're going to see this word here, anti-communist. Well, part of the story that used to read like this is sort of some of the nucleus of this centered around some of the students and professors at City College in New York City. So I was involved for many years in the City University system there. So I had kind of an interest in this piece of the history. So these people, and they would have, Most of them were from the perfidious group, and they were hardcore Trotskyites. And your average American wasn't sitting around thinking about Trotsky or the World Revolution and getting on the right. It's a very unique urban kind of group of people that were very small but influential. And so they were these kind of, sometimes they'd be called red diaper doper babies, or even people that came out of the movement would call them that. So they were literally like born into this red kind of idea with some of the illusions that we can change human nature and we can somehow shift or change the capitalist system. Now, and eventually some of them would realize the true communist agenda is just what Manning Johnson told us is world domination. And it's not domination for the sake of peace and equality and granola. It's a cruel overtaking of the world resources by the commanding heights of the economy. So the story goes something like this, that almost overnight, this group of students and intellectuals up at City went from being way over here in short order to becoming this thing called neoconservative and being critiques of it. So it's a very radical change that happened in a very short period of time. With most of the change, now these people are writing journals and newspapers and editorials and so forth with this new idea of revamping the conservative movement with this new idea. So conservative, America is always understood to be, we're here to protect our nation and borders, and that's what we do. We're a republic. That's what republics do. They have a common good and they protect their borders. They're not imperialistic by nature. That's not part of the definition of them. So they're going to create an expanding definition, which in order to protect our borders, we're going to seek liberal markets anywhere, create liberal markets all over the world, even if we have to attack people to create these markets, and that will just give us increasing security. And this is the kind of rhetoric when we have our best friends in the world or the friends over in the Middle East, they help us expand these markets and create this sense of security, never really probing what the deeper agenda is, which is, I would say, for both the left and the right, the woke, and what this group is going to become, they're going to become the anti-woke. And part of that, they share this agenda that Nesta Webster is going to talk about when she delves into the sources of world revolution. So a little bit more here. So yeah, it's important to kind of see that this is a small, basic New York clique that is really working like the communists on one hand. It's really especially to create this greater land mass over in the Middle East for more security, the greater landmass project over there. And I want to highlight with you a little bit about Leo Strauss. He's considered one of the intellectual founders of this movement. He's especially associated with the New School for Social Research. That's in downtownish New York. I guess you'd call it Greenwich Village. And he would be a group of scholars refugee scholars that came over during the Second World War. And they started working through this agenda. So some of this is you're going to get a lot of the Frankfurt School ideas associated with this movement over here. But he's probably more associated with the University of Chicago. And his ideas are pretty tricky to get your head around. But one of the things he's going to push is this phrase right here, Judeo-Christian heritage. And if you look at the history of, for example, Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy, we do not use that phrase in the Roman Catholic Church, nor does the Eastern Church. This is an invented modern church. It comes with this Zio-Christian mindset that's been framed, the sort of egregore of this alternative view of redemption history. And what he's going to suggest here, I'll give you a couple parts of this, but one of the key features here, I'll just get to it. Basically down here, he's a Straussian, means you're a neo-Wilsonism. And Wilson, he created the League of Nations, and that was supposed to be the original world government. And a lot of that came out of Wilson's handler, Colonel House. and he had his associations back to the Kremlin and to the city of London himself. So what you're talking about is building this is a new type of United Nations with a new vision of it. And, he would so much as say centered in Jerusalem. And the idea is that you have to, Strauss would emphasize a moral clarity that led Straussians to develop an approach to international relations. And again, it's highly militaristic, it's highly interventionist, it's highly chicken hawk, meaning the type of people that create this and their own, they're not going to get involved in the conflict. They're going to profit from it, but they're not going to get involved. But here's one of the key takeaways, I think, from Strauss. One of his big things for him and his students, and his students are basically, the usual suspects down here. Bennett, you're going to get some goys like Gingrich and people in government locations. And of course, Rumsfeld and Cheney are part of the Bush doctrine. They're going to come out of this. But one of the key ideas, and it really fits with this idea of a cabal, which is this idea of the noble lie. And that's what would be when he'd have his small groups, whether it was students or his associations or his affiliates or people he would communicate with on editorial boards. This was the theme, and their inner circle would talk about the noble lie. That's Plato's noble lie. We have this grand vision, and even Mersheimer, he's the most noted international relations scholar. Sometimes he's over on the show Judge Napolitano. He'd even talk about the grand lie that's used in Iraq and beyond, and the idea is your average person doesn't like war, and they don't like spending a lot of money on war. So you never sell them war, you sell them freedom, you sell them security, you sell them open markets, you sell them love, you scare them with stories of dead babies, and that's how you kind of trigger them. And so the noble lie is that, our inner group knows what the true messianic aims are of this project, but we'll tell the goyim, that is the uninitiated, all the freedom and flag waving and bald eagles, and they have a high sense of disdain for them, just as the Reds, when Manning Johnson's talking about the disdain that they had for the Negroes, it's the same kind of disdain they have for the goyim, the uninitiated, those people that aren't part of the noble lie. They look down on them. And they like to just lie to their face, like weapons of mass destruction. Oops. And then when they're profiting and going over there and death and mayhem and profit for the few that made the decision, then if you dare to speak against, now, I'm trying to find the phrase in here, because initially they got disillusioned with the Negro group and started to call them anti-perfidious ones. And with the newer criticism, what you're getting is there's this phrase with all the, with the ever-changing definition of whatever anti-perfidious means, it's now included, and you can't say things that have traditionally been understood as true within Scripture, the role of Christ, the role of the people who killed Christ. So that's actually on the slate to become part of hate speech. But one of the movements also is to be anti-neocon, is to be anti-perfidious. And so you would have to have checked out of the room, not to be critical of these policies over the last 20 years, but most people have. So part of the great sleight of hand that they've done here is we're incapable. We're too busy gender on gender. And he said, what are your pronouns? And this babble, instead of just having some sort of both common sense and basic critical thinking abilities to say that, wait a minute, who's profiting from this? And what is the direction? And be able to see whether we call this communism and woke, or it's really neocon. Well, we'll see it in a second, what it literally is, because it's actually written here. But how it disguises itself, not in terms of really thinking heavy policies that people, what's the gold standard, what ought to be a good, healthy policy for American interventionism. Instead, it's just, I'm going to retaliate against those woke people. So it's really just getting, and that's the very lowest aspects of democracy, getting down in the mud with the he said, she said, getting triggered. Everybody's getting triggered all the time. You can see the mind virus in another, but can't see it in yourself. I want to finish with this. A key neoconservative policy document. This is coming out in the early 1990s. You'd have people like Cheney involved in it, but it's the usual suspects. It's called A Clean Break, a new strategy for securing the realm. And this is what we're living to right now in the mid-2000s, commonly known as Clean Break Report, was published in 1996 by a study group of American Jewish neoconservative strategists led by Richard Pearl on the behest of a newly elected Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. And this is what we're seeing played out right now. So this program, this guy, Satan Yahoo, can come here and get for what we're talking about, just cleaning out the Middle East for this ancient project to be realized at any cost, no questions asked. In fact, if you ask a question, you might be put on like one of the communists list, but they're not the communists lists. So, and this whole idea has been, so he's coming here, everybody's clapping like a seal for this mass murder. And the only thing Americans can kind of think about at this point is we got to end wokeism. But it's really, we'll find out in our next readings that it's the same fundamental force that's animating both, that's keeping you locked into this basic dialectical tension. The report called for a new, more aggressive Middle East policy, clear out the real estate, including Ukraine, on the part of the United States in defense of the interest of Israel, including the removal of Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, and containment of Syria, still going on through the series of proxy wars. And when I say right now they want the whole world to be useful idiots, the other way of saying that is proxy warriors. So it's all a theater to them, and you're part of the window dressing. You're one of their useful idiots if you do not challenge the narrative. And if you dare challenge it, they'll probably either, they'll memory hole you, hurt your career, or you'll, like Manning Johnson, end up in an unexpected accident. The outright rejection of any solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that would include a Palestinian state and the alliance between Israel, Turkey, and Jordan against Iraq, Syria, and Iran, former United States Secretary of Defense and leading neoconservative Richard Pearl was the study group leader, but the final report included ideas from fellow conservatives, pro-Israel right-wingers, and affiliates of Netanyahu's, I'll use the word extreme, Likud party, such as Douglas Feith and all of the rest. And then we got what would need to trigger this. From this, we get ideas that would be created in 1999, the Project for the New American Century. And that's this vision for this greater Israel, somehow selling people that this is going to benefit you all. You'll have greater security, more open markets, more prosperity, more love. And that all that would be necessary, they really tipped their hand here, would be a Pearl Harbor kind of event. And then, when that event happened 2 years later, a lot of people kind of thought about that report. And that I was familiar with the report at the time. And they removed it from the web page pretty fast, but it was on, they didn't call it a Wayback Machine there, but people had copies of it. So who benefits? We could say who benefited from all of these revolutions throughout history that Nesta Webster is going to talk about. Who benefits and to what end? And what is the ultimate project? In other words, what are the aims of this cosmic conspiracy against God and man, against Christ and his church? And some of that we can see in the subtitle of Nesta Webster's book, World Revolution, The Plot Against Civilization, because one needs to be destroyed from the ashes. A phoenix will rise, which is this new messianic age, who it seems like President Trump is some kind of symbolic, if not quasi, indicator of the beginning of this age. So that's what I got for everybody today. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. And I guess where I'm going, I cannot even touch what Webster talks about. She's writing in 1920, and she's talking like that whole group of people that I've talked about that talk about the protocol, something that's forbidden even on here to talk about. So far I've talked about Captain Ramsey. He was imprisoned, even though he was very top of the chain of command. He had the ear of Chamberlain and so forth, because he exposed the cosmic conspiracy and even made reference to the protocols. He was in prison for 4.5 years. We've talked about Douglas Reed, one of the most famous journalists to come out of World War II, English journalists, Henry Ford, Father Fahey, Solzhenitsyn. We've talked about Father Julio Manville, and St. Maximilian Kolbe. And now we're going to talk about Nesta Webster. And I've only tapped and most of these people are just really a small time frame in mid-century. And again, just so I'm going through this and being a little bit more clear, from the Jewish side of things, majorly accomplished Jewish people at the same period of time: Myron Fagan, Benjamin Friedman, Elmer Berger, Henry Klein, and Alfred Lilienthal, all talking about the same cosmic conspiracy. And yet, if you go on YouTube today, how many people? I'm not like coming up with something new here. I'm just unearthing something. And the same something has been recognized within Roman Catholicism and indeed Eastern Orthodoxy for 2,000 years, century after century after century. And yet, to hold on, which the Bible, we talked about this last time in Scripture, when the world's getting crazy in this day of illusion and delusion, what do we cling to? Its tradition. And this is an essential feature of that tradition. And yet, are you going to have an audience for this information? For example, the reason I wrote my book with an address to traditional Catholics was because that, I think, is the last vestige in terms of the liturgy and the tradition that would want to hold on to this. But I frankly don't think there's a market for it. I don't think there's even an ear for it. And to the extent that people want to hear it, they can come to my channel. But if you want to hear the real stuff, you're going to have to go over to Locals. And I am going to hop over there right now, and we're going to talk about World Revolution. So I hope everybody's doing well. I'll be back here on YouTube in just a few days. This has been Dr. Deep State. And when I return, I'll have a nice fancy microphone, so you don't have to hear this one anymore. Thank you very much. And I hope all y'all are doing really well.